I'd like to talk today about the great German philosopher and existentialist Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche was born in Röcken, Germany in 1844. Uh, at the age of about 5, just before he turned 5, his father passed away, and Nietzsche was brought up by his mother, his younger sister, and a couple aunts. When he got older, he went to the university, and up until that time, his family had supposed he would become a pastor. His family was very Christian. But once he got into university, he began to question the religious teachings of his youth and became a philologist. Means he studied languages, especially ancient languages, Greek, Latin. He was very brilliant and uh, soon actually received a position to teach at a very young age, like 24 years old. uh, Among all the intellectuals of history, there are very few who are as deeply misunderstood as Friedrich Nietzsche. If you look online for discussions about Nietzsche's work and what he believed, for the most part, you'll find people who, it seems to me, mostly read the Spark Notes version of Nietzsche or something like that, because very few people seem to be actually familiar with the entirety of his work. They pick and choose certain things and are really unfamiliar with much of what he said. But the real reason, there are two reasons, I think, two main reasons why his legacy is so convoluted and misunderstood. And one is that he himself wanted to be provocative. He wanted to shock people. He was very unhappy with the state of philosophy and the state of religious moral values in the world, in Europe. And he really wanted to shock people to get them to change their way of thinking. So he's his statements are very much in your face, right in your face, and makes people like step back and say, whoa, wait a minute, what's this guy saying? The second reason why he's so misunderstood is that in 1889, at the age of 45, he had a mental breakdown. And from that time on, for the last 11 years of his life, was incapacitated. He couldn't speak or write or anything. I mean, he could speak, but he couldn't speak publicly. He couldn't write. And his sister took care of him eventually. And his sister confiscated all his notes that were unpublished and eventually published them. Now, his sister was a proto-Nazi. In other words, she was a Nazi before there were Nazis. She was a devout anti-Semite. It's odd because she was a Christian, but she was a devout anti-Semite. And she also believed in the supremacy and the superiority of the German Aryan race. So some of the two of the fundamental tenets of Nazism that arose later with Hitler, his sister believed already. And so his sister took his notes and reworked them and re-edited them and actually rewrote some things to make it sound as if Nietzsche was an anti-Semite who believed in the supremacy of the German people. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nietzsche hated anti-Semitism. He hated discrimination like that against peoples. And he thought that the German people were nothing special, that anything that was good about them, they probably got from some other group of people like the Slavs or the Poles or somebody. So what is it that Nietzsche actually believed and said and taught which has stimulated so much controversy? Well, first of all, when he began to think about the state of morality and just culture in Europe and in the world, he was shocked. He believed that the world was headed toward disaster, toward a period of complete nihilism. Nihilism comes from the Latin word nihil, which means nothing. So nihilism means a belief in nothingness. Nothing. There's no morality. There's no reality. Nothing makes any difference. Do whatever you want. Why did he think this? Well, he blamed it on Judeo-Christian morality. He said that Judeo-Christian morality was slave morality. He said that the ancient world, the Greco-Roman world, was a world of master morality, where people were rulers because they were strong. They could be noble, they could be magnanimous, but they ruled because of their force, their will of power, their just their ability to inflict damage on their foes. And so they ruled with force, and the ancient world believed that that which was good was anything which allowed me to achieve my goals. So if I wanted to be the leader and I wanted to conquer the lands and whatever helped me, that was good. Anything got my way, that was bad. With the advent of Christianity in particular, partly through Judaism, but especially through the advent of Christianity, many Christians in the early years were slaves themselves, and Nietzsche said he believed that they had a resentment toward the wealthy and the powerful, and so they developed, instead of a good bad concept of morality, they developed a good and evil. And from the slave point of view, power and wealth and all the things that were in the hands of the people who ran the world, those things were evil. And humility and meekness and asceticism and whatever, kindness, forgiveness, those were all good traits. Anything opposite of that was evil. And so evil had to be destroyed. And he said, what happened then was through the advent of Christianity, you get a revolt, a slave revolt in morality, where that which is good and healthy and strong for people and for countries is accused of being evil. And so he really saw the church, the churches, the religions and the churches as being the implement of the destruction of society, because they're telling people just be meek, be a slave. Think about it. In the 1800s, 1800s, in the United States and in Europe, slaves were told, don't question, just be grateful that you're a slave. Be meek and humble, because if you are not meek and humble, that means you're ungrateful to God and you will burn in hell. So just be meek. Um, Many intellectuals were really upset with this kind of idea that Christianity is teaching people to be just defenseless sheep. Think about it. Even in the 1960s in America, Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to undo 100 years of Jim Crow laws and segregation. Yet many Christian ministers wrote him a letter and said, Dr. King, I think you should just slow down. You should be meek and humble and wait your turn. And eventually things will come around, but you have to just be patient and passive. Dr. King was not patient or passive. He wasn't angry. He didn't throw bombs or start fires or burn down white churches, but he insisted on protesting the segregation laws that were still in effect after 100 years after slavery was outlawed in the United States. So Nietzsche said that this emphasis upon the slave morality, upon just accepting things and not caring whether you're a slave or not, just being meek and humble and going along with the other sheep, he said that is predicated on the idea that nothing in this world matters, that if you're just meek and humble and a slave, when you die, you go to heaven. But then that means that nothing in this world matters according to this morality. This morality has nothing to do with real life. And he said, that's wrong. And we have to get rid of this morality. We have to undo it. So what he wanted to do, just as Descartes attacked everything from the point of view of epistemology, of trying to doubt everything from the point of view of epistemology, Nietzsche pretty much did the same thing with ethics. So Descartes started with his method of doubting everything, and then tried to find out what could he know absolutely, which was the starting point of knowledge. Well, Nietzsche says, let's do the same thing with ethics. We'll throw out everything. So he called this the transvaluation of values, or the revaluation of values. And it was quite radical. And many of his statements are really caustic attacks on Christianity and ascetics and the meekness and humility and the Christian virtues. And he says what people need is a life-affirming virtue, not a death-affirming virtue. Now, on top of that, he also, especially in the Thus Spoke Zarathustra, talked about the death of God. He did it earlier, but it became much more prominent in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And he said that God is dead because we've killed him. Now, many religious people take this as a great affront. Oh my gosh, Nietzsche is an atheist, agnostic, whatever. We can't listen to him. But actually, Nietzsche never made any claims about metaphysics. When he talked about the death of God, he wasn't talking about the metaphysical reality of whether God existed or not. He was saying that because Christianity was promoting the slave mentality, where preachers would get up in the pulpit and say, look, you must believe and accept this doctrine. You must accept my statements to you. You must obey what I tell you, or else you'll go to hell. You just have to be a meek, whatever, worm, sheep, whatever it is. He said, this is killing God. This makes God completely irrelevant to modern man. So he predicted the total annihilation of moral values in the coming centuries after his life and death. He also talked about the will to power. And this is unfortunate. He mentions it a few times. And at one point, he was actually planning to write a book entitled The Will to Power prior to his mental collapse. But before he did that, before he collapsed, he had actually written in his notes that he thought that that particular statement, the will to power, was actually misleading. It didn't really characterize what he was trying to say. And this is where Nietzsche becomes misunderstood, because it is true that he felt that the average person was kind of weak and could never actually get out of that sheep-like mentality. But he said some people can, and those people deserve to be the leaders, deserve to be the rulers. So people interpreted Nietzsche, his sister interpreted her brother as meaning might makes right. If you are strong, you should dominate other people and, crush them and do your will. But strangely enough, in some of his later writings, Nietzsche said, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a will to dominate so much as a will toward freedom, or I guess you might say in today, transcendence, becoming more than you are. And in fact, he finally, having pretty much trashed Christian morality through many of his writings, he later says the greatest exemplars of this will to power are the Christian ascetics. Those people who struggled with themselves, who fasted and prayed and maybe beat themselves, whatever. They did everything they could not to please their neighbor, not to please the priest or the pastor, but to find in themselves and release in themselves something greater than they were already. So he calls this striving, this will for power, will for freedom, will to freedom. He says this will result in the creation of an Übermensch or Superman, the person who's above and beyond human beings. Now, it is true that Nietzsche had a pretty low evaluation of the average person. He didn't think average people were much better than animals because most people just acted in a herd-like fashion. And that's what he really hated most of all. He really felt that people should be themselves. People should actually try to be themselves and be their true selves and not just accommodate their neighbors. In one passage, he says the greatest common denominator of all people that he's met is their tendency toward laziness. And because they're timid, they don't want to offend their neighbor. They want to, just get along with everyone. And so he says, why is this? Why do people just want to get along? Everyone is unique. Why don't people want to investigate and really promote that uniqueness for the world to see? Instead, we hide behind convention because our neighbor does that. Our neighbor hides behind convention, and so we think, to hide behind convention ourselves. Why? because we don't want to stand out. We don't want to be ridiculed or criticized by our neighbors. And he said this is a matter of laziness. People are lazy. They don't want to make the effort to be themselves. So what happens then, this whole idea of self-transcendence and self-mastery, to a large degree, has gotten lost because of Nietzsche's sister promoting this anti-Semitism and Nazi-like propaganda. People think of this will to power as a will to crush others. But in Thus Sprach Zarathustra, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche says, no, I would like the great masters of the human race to be kind, to be generous to people around them. Because if you are a person who has great power, the greatest power is the power to dominate yourself. And by being gracious and benevolent and noble and kind to others, when you don't have to, when you can freely be kind, not out of necessity, but out of generosity, he said that is true beauty. And that to him is the ultimate Übermensch. The ultimate person is the one who can be a good person, a generous person, even though they don't have to be a good and generous person. So this whole idea of Nietzsche as being some kind of madman who wanted the powerful to crush the weak, this is simply not true. This is simply not what he really wants. Even though I will admit, there are places where he talks like that in some of his writings. It seems that that's what he wants. But really, most of that, he's trying to shock people, wake people up, and get them to rethink their moral values. Basically, what he's saying is if you want to stop this nihilism from occurring, you first have to get rid of all the stuff, all the garbage, and rethink what is truly important. So a lot of other people who followed Nietzsche were very influenced by him. I mean, the list is enormous, the number of people who were influenced by him. If you want to get a really good reading of Nietzsche, buy one of the books by Walter Kaufmann. He was a Princeton professor of philosophy who translated all of Nietzsche's works, or at least most of them. He read Nietzsche very fully, completely, and has given a very good explanation of what Nietzsche really was trying to say. I will admit that there are many places where Nietzsche seems to be saying something else, but in the end, it seems to be that he really wants people to be good, to be generous, not because they're forced to, not because they're weak and they have no choice, but because they've gotten mastery of themselves and they're willing to be generous out of the goodness of their nature. In fact, Walter Kaufmann compares Nietzsche to the great Chinese sage Lao Tzu, who was the founder of Taoism, who said, the person who can go into nature and just get in touch with his real self and be the master of his real self will then be the master of his life, will be the master of his community. And Lao Tzu was certainly not preaching violence. He was preaching self-control, self-mastery. And Kaufmann believes that this is the ultimate desire of Nietzsche, although his way of going about it was very provocative. And the other thing was, people started a rumor 100 years ago or so that he died of syphilis, and that hounded him for a long time. It turns out that his mental collapse does not bear the symptoms of syphilis, but rather probably a brain tumor that was growing through much of his life, and it really finally drove him, to a mental breakdown in 1889, and he died then in 1900. So I hope you like this little synopsis on Nietzsche. I'm sure that there may be others out there who will vehemently disagree with me. I don't care. Most of the people who talk negatively about Nietzsche are people who have not read most of his writings, so I'm really not too worried about that. And in any case, I think Nietzsche was way ahead of his time in trying to understand what people really needed to do to become their true selves. So I thank you. I hope you have a good day.